So I'm super honored to be sitting here with Laura and Andrea, some huge inspirations and friends to me over the past years. It's so fascinating the way that they have been cultural critics about Web3. They're both professors with a deep expertise in overlapping areas that they will discuss here with you, and their reading of Exocapitalism, which maybe if you could show, the book of the year for many folks in our community. I think they have a very articulate reading of how the topics laid out in this book are reflective of what is going on in the Web3 space, in general, the kind of big tech spiraling out of control vortex that we are in. So maybe if you could share a little bit about your work and what brought you to being fascinated around these topics, and then we'll go a bit more deeply into talking about the book.
Hi, thanks Beth for having us. Very, very cool to be here. So my name is Laura. I'm a researcher. I've been involved in the Web3 ecosystem for about the past 10 years. Before it, perhaps it was really called Web3. And I started to be involved in it in an academic context, and then I moved to work in more applied research with other internet, working with protocols on questions of governance, also looking at the labor contribution economies in DAOs, and thinking about developing alternative infrastructures than the one that we currently have. And I guess I come to these topics through an interest into financialization, and then there's open infrastructures. And I guess for the past 10 years, perhaps the zeitgeist, or I guess a lot of the excitement around the blockchain, around Web3, was the time of like the big infrastructural imaginaries and utopian like initiatives to create new institutions. And I guess after AI came around a couple of years ago, or started to be commercialized in this like mass distribution phase. And I guess reading Exocapitalism for the last 6 months has helped us make sense of a lot of things that went on in Web3 and what we cannot, but also what we could do about it, perhaps. So.
Great, yeah, maybe by mode of introduction, I wear 2 hats. I am an academic, as introduced here, and I have been working in Web3 with a project at the intersection of ecology, technology, economics, trying to think about how to reroute digital economy funds into biodiversity stewardship, trying to route the funds, so to speak. And I would say that from the academic background, I have dabbled for a long time in the question of what makes haves and have-nots in the world. How was the international economic legal system developed over the past century? So really with a longue durée view of how is it that the global south is constantly missing out? What is it in these patterns that makes it so that there is always a winner and a loser? And I would say that maybe that is a take on sovereignty that doesn't come through the privacy angle, but comes really through an angle of economics and economic thinking, because as much as you would have sovereignty as a legal construct for governments of the global south for a long time, the economic dependency remained. And so for me, going into Web3, what made it so interesting was the idea of recoding values, the possibility of building an alter economy bottom up, and seeing what you can do with that in order to escape what would be a long legacy system on a very different scale. And I think that basically similar to what Laura just said now, having done this and having tried to do this in the Web3 space for 6-7 years, it's not looking great for any of the projects that are trying to do some kind of regenerative care, social work in this space. And the question is, what happened? Why is that so? And so when Laura introduced this book to me via our shared friend and colleague Eric, we started discussing it because it seemed to explain a lot. of the sentiment that we had experienced in the Web3 space. So that's the reason why we want to bring this here. We are not the authors of the book. We haven't written it. We also don't fully subscribe to everything it says. But there are things in here that are expressed in a way that we weren't able to do ourselves, and then puts their finger on something that's going on that seems extremely important to keep in mind for trying to think, how do we build together into the future?
Awesome. So maybe can you share a bit of a summary about what the book is about, and of course the most interesting part, which is what captured your attention as a way for structuring and understanding some of the complexity that's going on?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very big task to try to do that, so I'm not going to do it, and I'm not going to do justice to it. But I do think that one of the things that is interesting in this book is it really it puts forward a theory of value. And if you spend time in an academic context thinking about value and different theories of value, you cannot help but be confronted with a Marxian theory of value, which brings value to labor, which says labor is the input of value into the system and surplus value is extracted. And one of the most provocative things that this book does is that it kind of moves away from this. So I'm going to dare to read to you a little bit from this because I think that it just does the job much better than when I try to express it. So they say this principle, which is basically exocapitalism, also flips the Marxian construction of value and price on their head, from things that are extracted by a capitalist from a labor force to things that can be generated out of nothing, independent from any material logics, simply by virtue of the interposition of latency between worlds. And they make this a bit more concrete and palpable in many ways by saying that basically the movement that is taking place in the digital economy is a movement of buy, hold, sell. And sell happens at obviously a higher rate than the buy. So the whole magic is about how to do this well, buy, hold, sell. And in that sense, the question of the material underpinning of where the value comes from becomes secondary. It's not the primary input of value into the system. So I think maybe from here, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, basically the book describes exactly flips this idea of capitalism as something that is being historically constructed, and instead brings forward this idea of capitalism as a germ, a virus, something which is just this algorithm of buy, all, sell, of generating value out of nothing. And the authors describe the book as a cosmology, so not so much as a cosmology is something that speaks to higher truths, perhaps, but it's also something that feels somehow intuitively true, and it's something that helps make sense of certain dynamics, whether ultimately they are, I guess, true or not. I guess we are past the idea of truth. But yeah, what is interesting is it describes the software economy as the convergence of code and the dynamics of finance, basically, and retrojects that to the whole history of capitalism, basically. It's a very provocative thesis, but again, with all these problems that we have with it and that we'll perhaps discuss later, it helps, or at least it helped me to look at Web3 through this lens. Obviously, Web3 and blockchain is really about this further, perhaps, integration between the logic of finance or monetary, where money and infrastructure really come together. And so, and the book unironically describes finance in terms of tokenization, and so which is obviously something that it's very close to Web3 types of infrastructures. And so, yeah, this idea of thinking about labor labor not so much as an input for the production of value, but more simply as what is still needed to capital to generate volatility to be then further arbitraged and capitalized on. I guess it's something that helped me make sense, for instance, of the, like the contribution economy in DAOs and of also open source protocol development and why it's so hard to build support structures around these relatively novel types of work. Perhaps another provocation of the book that it says that capitalism is not our enemy. Capitalism literally doesn't care about the humans or doesn't care about the earth. All it cares about is to lift, to move further and further away from the material constraints into higher and higher realms of abstraction. And I think that's also something that has resonated a lot with the vertigo of a lot of the increasingly abstracted dynamics within the Web3 space and the combination of more sophisticated, perhaps financial mechanisms, while also perhaps, again, somewhat leaving behind the humans that operate within these systems.
Yeah, and I think that I would really highly recommend everyone to read the book because it's also written very attractively in many ways, and it has beautiful sentences like, capitalism has never been and could never be a smooth criminal. And I think that's important also again for the question of what is the input that is still needed from all that is regenerative and social labor work. So the whole machine collapses if there is no possibility of differentiation. It cannot be smooth. If it were smooth, it would be a perfectly automated system that is at zero at all times. So the differentiation that enables arbitrage comes from the living world. It just doesn't care what kind of living world that is and where the volatility comes from. And it's interesting to think with that if you then look at all of the grand inventions in Web3 that have made it so that we can speak about a market cap that is in the trillions. No, I mean, for anyone who has been in blockchain for a while, the number has been exacerbating upwards from 2016, 2017, and it's always a very impressive number to give to people who think, oh, Web3 blockchain, that doesn't matter, no one cares about it. I mean, no one would say that today anymore, but there was a long time in which people would say that, and this number of the market cap was a very impressive number. But when you look at where does this number come from, what does it stand for, then it does stand for this extremely empty value that is basically, we could also, I would like to say provocatively, what are we doing? Hodl the void. It's a phenomenon of collectively hodling the void. And so that's extremely problematic, and that continues to go also now that institutional investors are coming in. I recently read a report by the IMF about stablecoins, in which they are quoting, without having read Exocapitalism and not knowing what they are saying, that 80% of the stablecoin transactions are arbitrage transactions. That's the IMF looking at this. Saying that basically as we are still in the making, so they say this is a transitional thing, maybe there will be more use value, there will be more things. I think this is what they get wrong. This is the end game, the arbitrage game. This is not an intermediary state. So it's not just on a small level. I think that this is really what is animating so much and which makes it so hard then if you come and say, I would like to have funding for a project in which we want to do, equitable art shares, or in our case, in which we want to make sure that biodiversity stewards who are keeping this world alive, who are regenerating the things that we so eagerly depend on, should have a more sustainable funding stream. You cannot play on the same kind of X return as all the others are playing, because they can go further up in the lift movement, and they are faster and not so much dragged down, again, to use the vocabulary of the book. And so this is so I think if you look at it in this way, and if you face that fully, it becomes a bit dizzying, because the question is, okay, so if this is the big blockchain economy, what are we trying to do when we think that crypto holds the blockchain, Web3 holds the key for building an ultra economy, which in a sense was what I think drew so many to the space in the first place. And I mean, even sitting here on the stage, I find very interesting, 2018 was the first Web3 summit, and the space was buzzing with energy of trying to build something different. It was a political project where the politics, you know, we can discuss what kind of politics have all found their way into Web3, but the drive was a different one. So yeah, I think this is a bit the status where we are at, and the question is, what do we do with that?
Exactly. So I think, well, I guess I would ask that back to you, but first I would want to double click on something. I think it's, you know, one of my favorite pieces that Laura wrote that was super, influential to me was, I think it was in 2022, exploring about what the labor economy of DAOs looked like. And it was so important at the time because nobody was thinking in this way about, you know, what it felt like this emerging type of organization. Now it is a period piece of what a particular moment in like, what labor and the post-COVID tech world and in our space looked like. Can you speak a little bit to that, maybe using one of the ways of illustrating the lift and drag concepts in this book of, I mean, if that is something that makes sense to you? I think this is one that's very, really touches deeply to many people in this room, so.
Yeah, thanks. So it was, I think, 2022. It was, or even earlier perhaps, it was the peak of like the DAO moment where there were so many new DAOs popping up every day, and a lot of people like excited to contribute to them. And with Other Internet, we did this project called Web3 Work, to whom a lot of friends here also contributed. And the goal, or like the main finding there was that, generally there is again, people would contribute to these new types of organizations out of their intrinsic values and, intrinsic and abstract or intangible values. But then these systems were, and still are, I think, and that applies also to the open source software development economy to a large extent. These systems were unable to price in accurately what these values corresponded to. So the results was that we've seen a lot of burnouts, we've seen a lot of organizational dramas being played out in public forums and stuff. And again, and we tried, one of the big goals for us was to mobilize a lot of these protocols that we've been working with to develop some kinds of solidarity primitives or parallel sort of welfare models. We have the technologies, we have the mechanisms, we could do theoretically these things, but practically it would never, these aspects never realized, or never materialized to the scale perhaps that we were hoping, we were aiming for. I think reading this book, it was a bit of a form of therapy. It was like a way of understanding perhaps that we tried, but ultimately it wasn't only perhaps our fault, is that we're running up against a system or a way of increasingly abstracted and automated capital that, again, literally doesn't care about labor or only cares about labor insofar as it generates volatility, there is friction that then can be, again, capitalized on in certain ways. So for open source protocol, it's actually a feature, not a bug, that every 2 years, approximately 2 years, people churn out, and then new, fresh blood and excitement can come in to do exactly that same work. And obviously, from a human perspective, we see that there are limitations and there are weak aspects about it. It's important to build these types of infrastructural and institutional knowledge and be able to pass it on. But I guess for the that way of operating, this like of a protocol, ultimately it doesn't make such a big difference because yes, we have documentations, they don't really work, it maybe takes a bit longer to get up to speed with the with the minutiae of protocol developments, but these are things that for exocapitalism are easy to overcome, basically, like again, using the humans and spitting them out when they're not, they don't have enough, they don't have any more energies to do that type of work. So for the labor aspect, I think that was particularly, I don't know, interesting, particularly enlightening, perhaps, to look at these dynamics in open source development and contribution economies also through this lens. Then obviously I think there is so much. Is this all there is? I hope not. Or like I think there's many more things that exocapitalism is not focusing on, is not looking at, and these are where there's spaces that open up to develop counter strategies, perhaps. But I think this thesis, unfortunately, is being proven, correct.
Do you want to add anything? Because I also had an interesting question that made me think of, which is you had mentioned at one point, this feeling of, capitalism being a virus or the specific niche brand of capitalism that we're engaging in and like Web3 community. And just thinking of that and the comment about, things spinning out of control, like, is there a point that you would have identified where, the acceleration would not have been so drastic, or that like the complexity would not have been, increasing at such a, such a rate that became too much? Or is that not even necessarily the way of framing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can take different parts of the book in different ways. No, I mean, I think it, as Laura also said, it's introduced as a cosmology. It's introduced as a total claim, but I also think that it's introduced as such because it's a provocation into the space and because it wants to break kind of patterns of thinking that have become very embedded. And these patterns of thinking, I would say, are contextualizing, historicizing, making particular, and never making absolute. I mean, I am a big fan of the particular, and I really do also think that in many ways, the way that the book describes the world is true when you live in the world of Web3 and these protocols and these financialized things, but that's really just a mini part of the world. So let's say in economic value, it's giant. In lived experience, it's a blurb. So I think this is a bit where we can look at what is the lived experience, what does it mean, where do we find meaning? In the same way in which maybe we can note that people burn out, that there is no care for each other, the fact that it came so far also means that people are extremely dedicated and they are driven not by the exocapitalist lift. So there is a different kind of lift that I think drives humans to do things together, to care for each other, to make things with each other. And I think that this is something where, as a Web3 community, the question is, how do we do that? I mean, I think what Laura researched and described is we don't care for community sufficiently. We don't care at all in certain ways. And so I think there is a lot of gray between that, but I think that the lift phenomenon of humans wanting to be in service, humans wanting to do good things for each other, with each other, for the planet, I think that's a framing that, I mean, it's not the work of the book to have that framing, no, but I think that's the rest of the world in lived experiences in enormous ways, and I think paying attention to that part, being fully aware what we are facing, because it's a big convergence with a lot of power, but I don't think it cuts across everything.
Yeah, this is, there's so many things to continue digging into, and I'm like looking, 13, 12 seconds. So yeah, basically, I think to continue this conversation, if you want to go to the bread co-op room, then there will be 30 minutes or an hour to delve more deeply into it. Oh yeah, but one more point before that.
I just wanted to say, shout out to the authors. It's a great gift to the community to have this book. Thank you.
And who are the authors again? Yes.
Did you?
The name of the authors.
Yeah. Marek, Poliks, and Roberto Alonso Trillo.
So huge thank you to them. If you have